Hello friends, here's a video with some snips of a conversation that I had recently with a friend of mine.
Got some footage of you doing activities and especially over 80, and it's got a lot of responses, and the comments that you see on your page, your channel, are really got a lot of people trying to explore what you call functional awareness. And just for people like myself and others around that might be interested, can you explain a little bit more what is functional awareness?
What I call functional awareness is being aware of what you're doing in your movements. Right? There are people who explore movements, teach you how to move better, but they don't seem to explain how you're moving better. And I've only come to this fairly late because I've always been quite active. And I suddenly, maybe going back even 30 years ago, I suddenly started to realise that I couldn't function as well as I used to. Now most people think that's normal when you get older. And what I've come to basically overcome, and I've overcome injuries this way, as well as regaining a lot of my dysfunctionality, my inability to bend properly, inability to reach up high, inability to do a full squat, which came on me, and it's mostly taken to be because you age and you stiffen up. I've now found that to be untrue by overcoming it with what I call functional awareness. And that is, how do we bend? How do we move? How does this happen? If we think about it that way, instead of thinking, I just want to make it happen, it becomes a completely different perspective.
And if I understand it, because we've known each other for a little while now, and I think it was about 5 years ago, you had rotator cuff issues in your shoulder, didn't you? So you were having trouble actually raising your arm past vertical.
I had trouble with both shoulders, unfortunately, which I now understand by consulting some experts on the subject, that my shoulders were damaged by being a gymnast. I was a very high-level gymnast in my very early youth. I trained from about 11 years of age right through to about 16, and we had the type of training methods that wouldn't be allowed today. If you couldn't do something, or if it was too difficult, you just got told to go back and do it again. We didn't get anybody with no physiotherapy. If we had a strain, we were told, come back tomorrow and try again, you'll get there. This sort of thing. And I now realise, completely wrong, but that's in the past, and hopefully we've moved on, and athletes are trained in a different way today. But that damage that was done basically probably tore my shoulders, and I carried that injury right through to about maybe 10 years ago, when it started to show up badly, and I realised that I was having pain. Now, I didn't seek treatment for the pain because I just took it as part of life. I could still function quite well, but it got to the stage where the shoulders actually snapped. The diagnosis was both sides, the supraspinatus tendon had completely torn away, full thickness tears. That's what the diagnosis was. And at that point, when that actually happened, and it didn't happen from actually doing an activity, I recall exactly for the first shoulder, I had a very heavy workout the day before, and I had no effects at all, and was mentally congratulating myself on still being able to do a full kettlebell routine with a heavy weight. And I woke up the next morning. It could be coincidental, it may have happened, but I had no indication it was going to happen. Woke up the next morning with the most awful pain. Now, by the time, it happened to be a weekend, and by the time I sought medical opinion, I ended up at an emergency doctor who referred me for a scan and x-ray, and that's when they told me the shoulder was completely torn. The pain was excruciating, but apart from the pain, I couldn't move my arm, and it took 3 or 4 months of investigation to for the doctors to come to the conclusion. By this time I'd seen 2 specialists, had a nerve specialist look at it. There was no nerve damage, and the conclusion from both specialists was that the arm would never be useful again unless I had a complete shoulder reconstruction. They even showed me the ball and sockets they could put in and how it would all be wonderful. And my question at the time was, so I would get back 100%, be able to use the shoulder. And both of them said the same thing. I went from one to the other, asking the same question. And the answer was, we can't guarantee that. So I thought, well, I'm going to be no better off. I'll just wait it and see what happens. Now, in the meantime, as you do, I got onto the internet and investigated exactly what happens when you're in this situation.
Dr. Google said.
Dr. Google. I found that in some countries they don't prescribe renewing the shoulder. They prescribe rehabilitation through various means. And I tried that. I tried physiotherapy, the normal average physiotherapy. I got a couple of good people. They didn't help me very much. They took the pain away. I eventually found somebody who was a fill-in. I went to the physiotherapy session that I think I had at least 4 or 5 with the same very nice lady, and got there one day for the appointment. Apparently she couldn't come, so they put a guy who was a temp, and he himself was an athlete, and he went through all the motions all over again, do this, try this, all the tests, and I said, mate, I've done all this. And he said, yes, I know, I've got it written down, I'm well aware of that, I want to see what happens. And he ended up saying, I think it's functional, it is muscular driven. It's not the tendon that's stopping you from lifting your arm up. And he told me a completely different set of exercises that he thought would benefit me. And he told me this through his experience. Now, I tried the exercises in front of him, and I do recall he tried to get me to lift a 1 kilo weight. And that was from my waist height to hopefully above my head, but I couldn't even get it to nipple height.
Was that out front or out the side, lateral?
That was just up to here.
Yeah,
I couldn't
anterior.
lift it. I could not lift a 1 kilo weight, so which is about 2 pound odd. And then he said, I've been watching your movement, try it again with a ½ kilo weight, that's 500 grams. I tried that, it didn't work either, and finally we dropped down to 200 and I could make it move. And that's when he said, we just have to work on that. Now, I didn't actually go back to that guy because he was a temp at the time and he didn't show up again. I had one more session with the very nice lady, and by that time I realised that what the guy had told me, it did something to my thinking, and I worked out that I needed to activate the arm. And that's basically where my idea of functional awareness came from. What was stopping the arm from moving? They told me the tendon was torn, but that didn't explain why it wouldn't rotate, it wouldn't go every which way. The supraspinatus tendon, which I then studied, is responsible for the first 25 to 30% of lift coming this way, and it didn't make sense that I couldn't lift this way. I couldn't handle any weights. My arm was wasting away, and unfortunately at that stage I had a silly accident, and I knew immediately when that happened that I had torn the other tendon. So I had both arms going on at the same time, and I was in a real bad way. Now at that time I did take the man's advice, but I also used what I know of martial art, the internal aspects of Wing Chun in particular, that I had been studying for a very long time, and I'd been studying it more as a martial art, that is a defensive type of exercise routine, how to hit faster, and kick quicker, all those sorts of things that gave you some functionality. But here I was with 2 useless arms. So I started to use the idea that the mind controls your body. And I to this day have not gone back and had the tendons scanned again to see whether they've actually healed or whether there's another part of the mechanism of the shoulder taking over. But I have been able to exercise myself, I would say, through mind control of the process to where I can lift, not only lift my arms in any direction, I honestly think I have more flexibility, more movement than I obviously had before the tendons were damaged over the years, and I could never, for instance, touch my other ear and do things like that. Now, that's just normal to me, like it is to most people, but I have gone through 30 years of my life and I just couldn't do this.
Let's come in there, because I mean, you touched on a couple of things there, and again, we first met because when you were my neighbour, and then you started training me or sharing with me some of the, at least the entry-level stuff to do with Wing Chun, and we would have conversations about, you know, I think you were exploring aspects of what you could do and how can I do this, and that was years ago. It was like 7 or more years ago when, and you were quite dynamic then. You could have an effect with your internal power, at least when your structure was stacked and you had your body in alignment. And so I think you were exploring that, and because of my background in health sciences and other things, we were kind of bouncing ideas, but you were giving me the opportunity to learn at least the entry-level stuff with Wing Chun, and then we went on for some stuff. And so you were talking about the internal power of the martial art, and we might come back to that in a minute. But because I can understand certain aspects of how becoming centre and aware of your body through the relaxation of the forms and the movement and awareness of the forms gives you a better awareness of your movements, the joints and your posture and these other things. And also anyone, I guess, who's got a good personal trainer or who trains properly is becoming more aware of those things as well, to some degree, probably in a more physical sense. So coming back to the issue of what is functional awareness, you're talking about it being mind-driven, and how is it that someone like myself can consider getting functionally aware without having to get straight into going through the Wing Chun forms or a similar form of martial art form like Tai Chi or other?
Okay, that's a good question. I truly believe that most of the Oriental martial arts, and Tai Chi is a good one, it is actually a martial art. It's been watered down. It's well known that it now has many versions. Originally it was a defensive art. Chinese Oriental martial arts tend not to be aggressive. They tend to be more defensive rather than offensive. But the reason that they can defeat people who are attacking them that may be a lot larger, that's the whole principle, is to be able to control someone who may be attacking you when they are larger people. It's not a mind control as we are taught from a psychiatric point of view, or psychological point of view. It's more training your body to get what I was told originally, which is a very difficult thing, because I had training in boxing, karate, judo as well, and I eventually ended up practicing MMA.
Yeah, I was going to say, didn't you do some MMA like when you were a bit younger as well? Like well before it was as popular as it is now.
It's very ego-driven, and I recall at the time, as I was getting older, and I could still bulk up, and I was very fit. I could take on people that I really shouldn't have done, which had contributed to part of the problems with my shoulders later on. But it was ego-driven. Now, when I began to learn Wing Chun, I had previously had a very good teacher with Tai Chi, a Chinese immigrant who came here, and to be quite frank, he gave up on me because he said I was too ego-driven to be able to learn his principles. And I still have a video of him that I took in a park, and there was a conflict of language and culture, and here I was ego-driven, muscular martial arts thinking guy, and this fellow did everything very gently, but he could easily control me. And from that, I decided I needed to learn something about what this guy was doing, but it just didn't work out with him. Now, quite a few years later, I used the form he gave me and kept doing that as a form of exercise, but I didn't really benefit much out of it. And when I decided to learn Wing Chun, I first went to a school that was again combat driven. They were combining it with with jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and I thought, yes, great, I'll learn that. And I found out that, you know, it was just the same old, same old. Now, eventually, I did find a school that were teaching what they called internal Wing Chun. And to be quite honest, I probably didn't really have an understanding, intellectual understanding. And again, I trained with these people for quite some time, and I was a beginner. And
how long ago was that? I mean, was that here on the coast?
It's nearly 20 years ago now.
That was here on the coast, wasn't it?
Yeah, on the coast. It's nearly 20. I had a go at it, and then I left, and then I came back. I was a physical fitness fan at that stage. I would do boot camp in the morning with the guys up on the beach at 6 o'clock. We'd do that for an hour and torture ourselves. And then I'd have breakfast, and I'd go and do 3 hours of Wing Chun, and then the rest of the day I'd go surfing or swimming. So that was my lifestyle. And from the Wing Chun, I started to question their motives and what they were talking about, because there wasn't anybody. I was at that stage the oldest one they'd ever had. I was already pushing 62 or 63 or round about that. And I kept questioning, well, you guys are teaching me this, but you still can't push me around. Now, what are we learning here? Until I got to see some of the senior instructors who could stop me moving, and I was very impressed. Now, at that time, unfortunately, again, I had a very bad injury. I now understand a lot more about it, and that's again touching on how I came to functional awareness. I was training with a professional boxer. I was his training partner, and we were pushing it, and I was doing the same training as him, except I wasn't getting in the ring. I was in my 60s, the guy was 20-something. He won a couple of tournaments, he took on all comers. He'd also been a kickboxer, but he turned to boxing because he claimed there was more money in it, and he was good at it. And our training eventually ended up in me, I think, tearing a tendon in my foot, and I can't recall exactly which one, but it was the tendon that supports the foot, and I couldn't walk on it. Now, basically, at that time, we're talking 20 years before the shoulder problems, I had an inkling of healing because I went to physiotherapy every day for about a year. And I had the TENS machine and all the practical use and everything else. But it wasn't, again, till I found somebody who trained athletes, runners, who was training them to avoid the problem I had. That told me what had actually happened. Again, they were talking about the surgeons that I went to at that time. I should have learned my lesson early on. They were talking about cutting into my foot and tying the big toe backwards.
So how did you do that injury? It sounds like it was the hernias or whatever, that long muscle under the foot.
That injury had no explanation.
Right. And how did you repair it?
It was a recurring injury that when I thought back about it, I'd had inklings of it, and I'd avoided doing anything about it probably 30 years before.
Right. So you're carrying it, and it
I
kind
was
of came
carrying
up
the injury,
pushing
and
through
it
the
snapped
train.
one day
Yeah.
when I stepped on the ground. I wasn't actually doing anything, but I'd obviously aggravated it. Now, there's another aspect of that, and we'll cut away from it for a minute. Since then, I have had my DNA tested, and they've come back with, I did it under an anonymous name. They don't know me. They couldn't possibly have known who I was. They had my age and gender, that was about it. And they came back with a recommendation of the types of activity that it was a sports assessment, DNA sports assessment, and it's available to young athletes now. It wasn't ever available when I was young, but apparently they can determine what you would be most suited for, your activities. And it turns out that most of what I've done, which was gymnastics, weightlifting. I was a competitive swimmer, but I wasn't much good at it. I served for a long time, which was really just a fun thing. But all sorts of short, muscular activity that didn't, more heavy lifting, that type of thing is what I'm more suited for, and that's what I slotted into. I have run marathons, but I didn't, you know, I managed to get the over 70s once, but that's not something I'll keep doing. That was again ego driven. But what this showed, going back to the DNA, it showed that I had a particular tendency, and there was a warning on it, that I had a particular type of tendon that couldn't take much strain. I should avoid strain. Given it actually said something like, given that you have the muscular ability to go above your limits, you should be very careful because you have the type of tendon mechanism that, or whatever the definition was, I can't quite remember. In other words, your tendons are going to be weak. Now, had I have known that early on, I could have avoided anything that put a strain on the tendons. And again, we come right back years later to functional awareness, where my awareness is, can my tendons take it, not can my muscles do this.
Because I mean in your tendons you got your fibrogen, your collagen, your elastin, and any of the combination percentages are going to give you something that's quite...
I have read and studied all that, but I mean it's not irrelevant because you may need to know it. But to me, the idea is that I need to know what the tendon's going to accept, not what my muscles can handle.
It's like the weakest link in the chain, isn't it?
It is my weakest link. It may not be everybody's. Now, getting back again to the Wing Chun forms, I was very fortunate to learn it properly, I think, and everybody has their own version you come to. I now, after 20 odd years, have my own version. It isn't any difference in appearance from what other people are doing, but my thought pattern is different. I am concentrating on how my tendons work when I'm doing a Wing Chun forms, rather than how my arm can bend or the muscles or the common, you know, move the elbow, mind games that people play. I just concentrate on opening up the tendons, like making them not flexible, just making them able to take the strain without giving them a strain. Well, it's very hard to explain.
No, and I think you've kind of, when we were talking about doing the toe touch, there was the first two in that video. So you've got the one which is physical, and that's just where you're saying people put their hands to the ground. Then you've got the second one where you touch the ground and you can put your hands flat. And I think before we started today, we were talking about expanding each of the gaps in the vertebrae as you rest down and you relax. But also, I think was one of the key points that you raised was it's also releasing all the posterior chain, allowing it to pivot from the hips as opposed to bend while everything else relaxes. And isn't this kind of what you're saying about as you go through the Wing Chun forms, is that when you're saying you're opening up the joints, it's actually just letting those prohibitions or where those muscles are possibly holding or the tendons are holding, you're letting them relax, but with a mental focus to that point and then move down the... Is that more or less?
It's something that's hard to comprehend unless you experience it. I know that sounds like, makes it mysterious, which is why we have this approach. The Oriental martial arts is something that you can't learn because you need to be Oriental. What it actually is functional awareness. It is the ability to realise what your body's actually doing. So, as you say, my concentration on bending forward to touch my toes is, on the spine letting go, because that's what's holding me erect.
Mm.
So in order to touch my toes without moving my feet, I need to be able to relax the spine and let it go, not hold it.
Mm.
And it's not the type of relaxation, because we can't learn to relax. We can't switch off the mechanism that's holding us erect unless we learn a pathway to do that. And that's what Wing Chun eventually teaches you, that the pathway is flexible. You can move the spine in any direction. And from your spine, you have control of your pelvic area, and from that you have control of everything else.
Even when you look at your toe touching, you can see that you're getting your, like, and with Wing Chun or anything you do, functional awareness, as far as I understand it, is, you know, having your posture stacked and moving in a certain way. So when you're doing the second time on the toe touch one, you've got your hips and legs in a position that allow a good pivot, the legs aren't in the way, and then you're allowed to free your whole posterior chain, including glutes, hamstrings, and all the way through the spine to get that deep pivot, bend, or that at least a stretch or a reach.
Well, what you've just described is a very good explanation of what people might, of the normal way of doing things. Now, the release comes from switching off. It doesn't come from consciously thinking you can move it, because that has a tendency to restrict your movements. It's like a simple demonstration, like almost all of the Western training techniques, and whether it's people seek help in personal training, or they take up a sport or a martial art that, like boxing, all the mostly Western pursuits teach you that they all have a gesture that goes like flexing your muscles. But what functional awareness and the Oriental take on it is that in itself may be an indication that you're quite strong, but it doesn't give you the ability to switch it off like I'm doing now. You can't control it, you can only flex it. You can't use it, it's stiff when you're using it. So when you switch it off, the arm becomes controlled more from your mind rather than it does from your muscular ability.